The first tier is what most people picture when they imagine starting an ammunition business: a reloading setup, a few thousand square feet, your own brand, and a website. Your ATF Type 06 federal firearms license, the federal designation that legally makes you a manufacturer of commercial ammunition, costs $30. Not $30,000, $30, renewable every 3 years at the same price. That is the lowest licensing fee the ATF issues for any active manufacturing designation in the United States. You source brass casings, primers, propellant, and projectiles from wholesale distributors, assemble them on progressive reloading presses, and begin selling commercially to ranges and online buyers. Equipment for a modest setup runs under $100,000. Gross margin on bulk commercial centerfire handgun ammunition at this scale is approximately 25%. The ceiling on net income from this tier is not set by regulation, it is set by throughput. You need millions of rounds per year before the numbers become anything more than a side business. The second tier is actual production. A small commercial facility between 30,000 and 100,000 square feet with automated loading equipment, climate-controlled propellant storage, ballistic testing infrastructure, and a quality assurance system capable of delivering consistent, sellable product. Acquiring a functioning small batch plant, either by purchase or by retrofitting an existing industrial space, runs between $5 million and $20 million depending on equipment condition, production line configuration, and the regulatory compliance history the prior operator accumulated. At this scale, your licensing burden expands substantially. The FFL is the minimum. You also need an ATF federal explosives license, state-issued explosive storage permits, EPA compliance for the hazardous waste streams generated by primer and propellant handling, fire marshal certification under NFPA 495 standards, and PHMSA hazmat certification for anything that crosses a state line. The third tier is institutional commercial scale. In April 2025, Winchester, the ammunition brand owned by Olin Corporation, completed its acquisition of the manufacturing assets of AEY Inc. for $75 million in cash. What Winchester received, a 185,000 square foot production facility in Manawak, Wisconsin, with brass shell case manufacturing capabilities and fully operational loading lines already tooled and running. $75 million for an operational mid-scale commercial plant with existing regulatory clearances, existing supplier relationships, and existing production capacity. Building that from scratch costs more, takes longer, and carries more execution risk. This is the market price for a working facility. The fourth tier is defense production. In February 2024, Rheinmetall broke ground on a new artillery ammunition facility at its existing site in Unterlüss, Germany, a self-financed project representing approximately 300 million euros in capital investment, roughly $325 million at the time. At full capacity, planned for 2027, the plant will produce 350 0 rounds per year of NATO standard 155mm artillery ammunition. For context, the U.S. Army announced in late 2023 that it was requesting $3. $1 billion in emergency supplemental funding just to expand existing domestic 155mm production capacity, not to build new plants from scratch, to expand ones that already exist. The range from first license to serious defense scale player is $30 to $300 million. That spread is not a quirk. It maps every layer of regulatory capital and operational barrier that stands between a reloading table and anything that moves the needle in this market. Here is the regulatory sequence between signing a lease and selling your first commercial round. The ATF's Federal Firearms Licensing Center is legally required to act on a properly completed Types 06 application within 90 days. That 90-day clock starts only after ATF determines your submission is properly completed, a distinction that matters because incomplete applications restart the window. Every officer, director, partner, manager, and owner with any business authority at your company is a responsible person under federal firearms law. Every one of them undergoes a background check. 1 disqualifying criminal record, 1 prohibited person status, 1 material misrepresentation on the application form, and your license is denied. There is no parallel track to reapply while you continue operating. If your manufacturing process involves energetic materials, primers, smokeless propellant powder, any explosive component, you need a separate federal explosives license from a separate division of ATF. These 2 licenses run on separate timelines, processed independently by separate departments within the same agency. There is no coordinated joint approval. At the state and local level, explosive storage permits under state fire codes, county zoning variances in most jurisdictions, because standard industrial zones prohibit the quantity of explosive materials required for meaningful production volume. Fire marshal inspections tied to NFPA 495 standards for explosive material facilities, and environmental permitting that in many states triggers a formal environmental impact assessment, a process that can run 12 to 18 months before construction begins. The EPA's Resource Conservation and Recovery Act classifies the waste your operation generates: primer material, spent propellant residue, contaminated wash water from brass case processing, as explosive hazardous waste. Disposal requires licensed hazardous waste contractors with specific authorization for your waste stream, not a regular waste hauler. If you intend to pursue any government contract, add ITAR registration through the State Department, a DCSA facility security clearance, and a CAGE code through the Defense Logistics Agency. Budget 18 to 36 months from first license application to first military qualified shipment. Every step above is a genuine stop work condition if you fail it. This is not a one-time compliance exercise. It is an ongoing posture that costs money every year regardless of how many rounds you produce. The faster entry path is not building from scratch. It is acquiring someone who already has the permits. When a licensed ammunition manufacturer closes, fails, or restructures, its regulatory history does not evaporate. Its ATF licenses, its zoning variances, its EPA compliance records, its classified supplier approvals, its existing government contract relationships, all of it is potentially transferable through an asset acquisition or an operating entity purchase. The buyer inherits years of accumulated regulatory standing instead of restarting the clock at 0. The most extreme illustration of this principle is the transaction that dominated the ammunition industry in 2023 and 2024. In October 2023, the Czechoslovak Group, a Czech private defense company, agreed to acquire Vista Outdoor's sporting products division for $1.91 billion in an all-cash transaction. What they were buying: the Federal Premium, Remington, Spear, CCI, Alliant Powder, and Heavy Shot brands, plus manufacturing capacity representing approximately 70% of the primer production infrastructure for commercially available ammunition in the United States, plus the management contract for the Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Independence, Missouri, a government-owned, contractor-operated facility that produces roughly 4 million rounds of military-grade ammunition per day. CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, reviewed the deal for nearly 9 months. U.S. senators objected publicly. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo opposed it on national security grounds. CFIUS cleared the transaction on June 25, 2024, reportedly with conditions attached including a supply assurance agreement requiring CSG to maintain U.S. domestic ammunition availability. The buyer spent $1. $91 billion and bypassed 2 decades of compliance infrastructure buildup in a single transaction. That is the trade. If you can afford to pay that way, you understand immediately why it is worth it. Here is how the money actually works, stripped to its base structure. You are converting raw materials, copper alloy for brass cases, lead or copper-jacketed lead for projectiles, small quantities of lead styphnate for primer cups, nitrocellulose for propellant, into ballistic components at a per-unit cost lower than the buyer's willingness to pay. The margin per round is measured in fractions of a cent on bulk military contracts and a few cents on commercial retail. The entire economics of this business are volume. At the granular level, a standard commercial 9mm round requires roughly 6 grams of brass alloy for the case, a copper-jacketed lead bullet, a small brass primer cup, and between 5 and 8 grains of fast-burning propellant. Estimated raw material costs at commercial scale run approximately 12 to 18 cents per round. The round retails between 25 and 50 cents depending on brand and market timing. Gross margin at scale, roughly 25% on bulk centerfire. Now apply volume. Winchester, through the Lake City Army Ammunition Plant, a government-owned facility in Independence, Missouri, that Winchester manages under a defense contract, is legally obligated to maintain capacity of 1.6 billion rifle rounds per year, 4 million rounds per day. The government's operating contract for that plant has a potential value in excess of $2 billion over 10 years. Winchester's commercial surplus sales from the same facility, military spec rounds sold into the civilian market, with the Pentagon receiving a few cents per round, generate an estimated $30 million per year in additional revenue. For comparison, the entire purchase price of AEY Inc's 185,000 square foot Wisconsin factory, including all production equipment and brass case making capabilities, was $75 million. Less than 3 years of Winchester's Lake City commercial surplus revenue estimate alone. The business model has exactly 2 viable configurations. The first, small-scale, high-margin, specialty product, match-grade rifle ammunition, precision defensive handgun loads, hunting-specific calibers, where per-round margins can reach 40 to 60% and volume requirements are lower. The second, institutional scale anchored by government contracts, where fixed costs become negligible against throughput. Everything in between is where most operators get stuck. High enough volume to require serious regulatory infrastructure, not high enough volume to make that infrastructure cost-effective. That band is where companies go to spend money without making it. The most documented collapse in American ammunition industry history is also a textbook study in what happens when financial architecture meets an event no spreadsheet can model. In 2007, Cerberus Capital Management, a New York private equity firm run by Steven Feinberg, acquired Remington Arms through a leveraged buyout at approximately $118 million in equity, plus $252 million in assumed debt. The structure matters. In a leveraged buyout, the acquired company typically finances a significant portion of its own purchase price and services, that debt from operating cash flows. Remington was made to do exactly this. Cerberus put in relatively little of its own capital. Remington held the obligation. Cerberus then formed a holding company called Freedom Group and used it to acquire additional firearms and ammunition manufacturers over the following years: Marlin Firearms, Bushmaster, DPMS, H&R. The total debt load at Freedom Group climbed toward $950 million against an asset base entirely dependent on consumer firearms demand. For a while, the fundamentals cooperated. Annual firearms unit sales tripled nationally between 2007 and 2016. A genuine demand tailwind driven partly by persistent political anxiety about possible federal gun legislation. The numbers looked viable on paper. In December 2012, a shooter used a Bushmaster AR-15, a Freedom Group product, to kill 20 children and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Within 6 days, Cerberus announced plans to divest its stake in Freedom Group, citing pressure from the California State Teachers Retirement System, which threatened to divest from any manufacturer of weapons banned under California law. Cerberus spent the next 2 years searching for a willing buyer at an acceptable price. In March 2014, the firm rejected a $1 billion buyout offer for Remington Outdoor Company. By March 2018, Remington Outdoor filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, carrying nearly $950 million in debt. A reorganization plan eliminated approximately $775 million of that load and extended the company's operating life. That plan lasted 18 months. On July 27, 2020, Remington filed for Chapter 11 again. The bankruptcy auction ran for 8 days via Zoom in September 2020. 7 separate buyers acquired parcels of the company. brands, factories, inventory, intellectual property for a combined total of approximately $157 million. Cerberus entered with a leveraged structure that worked during a demand supercycle, passed on its only credible exit at the market peak, and recovered a fraction of the original enterprise value after a single event made the asset permanently difficult to sell to institutional buyers. They never mismanaged the factory floor. They mismanaged the balance sheet's ability to absorb a shock they did not cause. The failure mode in that case was debt meeting an uncontrollable reputational event. This case is structurally different. This is fraud, concealed for over a year, dissolved by one federal investigation, and remembered today primarily because it became the premise of a Hollywood film. In January 2007, the U.S. Army awarded a contract worth approximately $298 million to supply Soviet-era small arms ammunition to Afghan security forces. The winning bidder was AEY Inc., a Miami Beach company. Its president and controlling officer was Efrem Diveroli. He was 21 years old. The contract specified that ammunition could not originate from China. I sourced rounds from Albanian stockpiles, old communist-era inventory stored in warehouses across Eastern Europe. Some of that inventory was Chinese manufactured. I employees repackaged those rounds, removed Chinese language markings, and shipped them under documentation representing the origin as Albanian. When the scheme was exposed in 2008, the U.S. Army suspended AEY from all government contracting. Federal prosecutors charged Diveroli with conspiracy to defraud the United States government. In January 2011, U.S. District Judge Joan Leonard sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison. AEY Inc. was fined $750 and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution to the Army. In August 2010, while on bond during the fraud proceedings, Diveroli met with an undercover ATF agent and handled firearms and ammunition, a federal crime for a convicted felon. A separate federal judge sentenced him to 4 years for that offense, with 2 years to run consecutive to the fraud term. A film called War Dogs, released in 2016 and based on Diveroli's story, was produced and distributed by Warner Brothers. The thread in this case that deserves more attention than it received. A 21-year-old with no documented operational track record won a $298 million Defense Department contract through a competitive government bidding process. ATF licensing requires background checks on every responsible person at a company before approval. Government contracting apparently required less diligence before awarding Diveroli a $250 million supply agreement. The criminal investigation that followed focused on the contractor. The procurement officers who cleared that contract profile for award are not part of the public record of consequences. Diveroli went to prison. The contracting system that approved him did not change in any verifiable public way. 4 rules come directly out of these 2 cases. 1. Do not leverage the factory. The production facility is your operating asset. It is not a vehicle for financial returns. Cerberus treated Freedom Group's balance sheet as a structure for capital extraction and created a company too debt-laden to survive any serious external shock. When the event that made the asset unsaleable arrived, there was no room to respond. Your cost structure needs to work at 60% of peak demand. If it does not work at 60% of peak, the leverage has already made the decision for you. 2. Every layer of your supply chain is a compliance declaration. AEY's entire operation collapsed because one stratum of their sourcing was undisclosed and contract prohibited. Government contracts involving ammunition and weapons components require country of origin documentation throughout the supply chain, not just at the point of final assembly. Any undocumented gap is a criminal exposure, not a paperwork issue. Verify the origin of everything before the contract is awarded, not after the shipment is questioned. 3. A government contract is not revenue. It is a legal obligation with penalties for non-performance, ranging from financial clawback to contract termination to debarment from all future federal work. Debarment is company ending in a business where government buyers represent a significant share of total addressable volume. Understand what debarment looks like before you pursue your first government award. Read the base contract clauses, all of them. 4. The license costs $30. The person problem costs everything. AEY Inc.'s executives concealed that a co-founder was functioning as a de facto executive officer at a public company in direct violation of a 2020 federal court order, barring him from exactly that role. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed charges against 3 former executives in December 2025. The company restated 2 years of financial filings. Its manufacturing assets were sold. The $30 license was not the liability. The undisclosed individual in an executive function was. In an industry where every person with organizational authority is a responsible person under federal law, the human compliance problem never resolves itself. It requires permanent active management. The single largest structural threat to a commercial ammunition business is not the regulatory environment, not raw material commodity pricing, and not competition from overseas manufacturers. It is the demand cycle. Civilian ammunition consumption in the United States, the largest commercial ammunition market in the world, does not follow a normal consumer product demand curve. It follows a political anxiety curve. When federal firearms legislation appears plausible, civilian stockpiling drives demand sharply upward. When legislation does not materialize, demand normalizes, sometimes aggressively. The spikes are unpredictable in timing, and the corrections are equally unpredictable. After 2020, the U.S. civilian ammunition market entered a historic supercycle driven by pandemic-era purchasing behavior and political uncertainty. Winchester, Federal, Speer, and Remington all cited record production volumes in 2021 and 2022. Manufacturers extended equipment operating hours, added production shifts, and in several cases accelerated capital spending to expand capacity. Retail shelves ran consistently empty across most calibers for nearly 2 years. By 2023, the civilian market had normalized. Retailers held inventory purchased at peak prices. Wholesalers were discounting to move stock. Manufacturers who had borrowed against peak revenue projections to fund expansion found their debt service obligations no longer covered by normalized unit economics. The global ammunition market was valued at approximately $28 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach approximately $36 billion by 2030, a compound annual growth rate of roughly 4 to 5%. That projected growth is almost entirely defense-driven. NATO member states are rebuilding stockpiles depleted by transfers to Ukraine, and defense budgets across Europe and Asia have risen materially. The U.S. Army alone requested $3.1 billion in supplemental emergency funding in late 2023 just to accelerate 155mm production. Commercial civilian demand is not growing at 4 to 5% annually, it is cyclical. Military demand and commercial demand respond to entirely different inputs, operate on entirely different procurement cycles, and collapse for entirely different reasons. If you build your commercial operation on civilian demand and rely on defense sector growth to absorb a down cycle, you are counting on 2 incompatible customer types to save you at the same moment. That is not a business strategy. That is a financing assumption. Time to pull it together and answer the actual question. How much do you make if you do this right? Scenario 1, the specialty small batch operation. Total investment, $8 million. $3 million to build out and retrofit a leased facility, $2.5 million in equipment, $1.5 million in licensing setup, legal costs, environmental review, and ATF compliance cycle expenses, and $1 million in working capital. Product: precision match-grade rifle ammunition, .308 Winchester, 6.5 Creedmoor, targeting the competitive shooting and serious hunting markets. Average selling price, $2.50 per round. Gross margin at 40%, $1 per round. To generate $2 million in gross profit annually, you sell 2 million rounds per year. After a staff of 5 people covering compliance, operations and administration, liability insurance, hazardous materials disposal contracts, and general overhead net margin on a well-run operation of this type runs approximately 10 to 15% of revenue. On $5 million in annual revenue, $500,000 to $750,000 in net income per year on $8 million invested. Payback period, roughly 11 to 16 years under stable operating conditions. This is a viable small business. It is not a capital investment that outperforms most alternatives. Scenario 2, the mid-scale commercial operator. You acquire an existing licensed facility for $50 million, comparable to the Manawak plant-level asset. You run it at blended commercial volume of 150 million rounds per year of standard 9mm .223 and rifle calibers. Revenue at a wholesale average of 30 per round, $45 million per year. Gross margin at 22%, approximately $10 million. Debt service on $35 million financed at 7%, roughly $2. $5 million annually in interest. Full operating overhead, compliance staff, quality assurance, environmental, logistics, G&A runs $5 to $6 million annually. Net operating income $1.5 to $2. $5 million per year on a $50 million capital outlay. Payback period, 20 to 33 years at steady state. The exception is a government anchor contract. If you secure and sustain a military supply agreement, the type with a potential value in excess of $2 billion over 10 years at the Lake City operating scale, the economics restructure entirely. Fixed costs become negligible against contracted volume, demand is predictable, and the business is worth owning as an operating asset, not just as a strategic bet. Without that anchor contract, you are running a commodity factory with cyclical revenue, constant regulatory overhead, and a payback timeline that stretches past the next 3 demand cycles. The margin is real. The timeline is not what you pictured. You came in thinking bullets are a commodity, and commodity businesses are simple. They are simple. That is the problem. Commodities are priced by the most efficient producer, and the most efficient producer in this market operates a government-owned facility that has received more than $860 million in taxpayer-funded capital improvements over the past 2 decades, runs under a contract potentially worth $2 billion over 10 years, and is managed by the company that just spent $75 million to acquire its nearest mid-scale competitor. You are not competing with a startup. You are competing with a contractor whose factory was paid for by the U.S. Army. The numbers work. The timeline is longer than anyone's pitch deck says. The regulatory traps do not appear in a pro forma until they have already been triggered. If that calculation is the kind you find interesting, the rest of our catalog is right here. Subscribe and we will keep running the numbers.